A warm welcome to this week's virtual event series. The NCRI is committed to identify and deliver activities that support the development of the cancer research community. We coordinate 19 clinical study groups and 15 clinical trial units that together ensure high-quality studies that are designed, run and translated into patient benefits. Research groups, patients and carers collaborate on trial developments to boost activity within various strands of research to deliver a positive impact. We are committed to keeping the cancer research community connected during this time of unprecedented disruption due to the COVID-19 pandemic. A complete list of the future virtual events can be viewed on our website or follow the link in the Q&A box. I will now hand you over to Dr. Richard Simcock from the Brighton and Sussex University Hospital NHS Trust, who's very kindly agreed to chair this session, and introduced our guest speaker, Dr. Vinay Prasad, Associate Professor of Medicine at the University of California.
Hello and welcome to this latest instalment of NCRI Virtual, and a session I've been very much looking forward to, as today we'll be in conversation with Dr. Vinay Prasad. My name is Dr. Richard Simcock. I'm a consultant oncologist from Brighton. I'll be putting some questions to Vinay, but I also be trying to put as many of your questions as I can as time allows. So please do put questions in the Q&A box. There is a democracy in action here, so if you vote up other people's questions, they're more likely to be answered. And if you're tweeting insights from this session, then please use the hashtag NCRI Virtual. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest, Dr. Vinay Prasad. He's a hemato-oncologist and associate professor of medical medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. He studies cancer, drugs and health policy. He's authored over 200 academic articles, but as well as being very prolific in what we might consider our traditional channels of medical communication, he's also been a trailblazer in discussing cancer trials in Twitter, and more recently in his often provocative and always entertaining podcast Plenary Session. And if that were not enough, he's recently just published a book called Malignant, which crystallizes a lot of the themes that he comes back to in Plenary Session, which I would say joins a canon of required reading on cancer trials, like of contributors, people like Martin Stockler in Australia, Ian Tannock in Canada, and Ben Goldacre in the UK, people who are prepared to say that the emperor is wearing no clothes, and that's certainly what Vinay has been happy to do. So welcome, Vinay. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Richard. It's a pleasure to join you today for this chat.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry that it's not in person in Belfast, but I hope that the NCRI will be able to get you over in person at some point in the future.
I would love for that. Look forward to that.
I wonder if we could just start by way of context. NCRI is a UK-based organisation. If you could give us some idea of what the research cancer landscape looks like in the US in terms of how is research organised, administered, how is it funded? A broad macro view of that, if you could.
Yeah, I think that would be sort of a great starting point for comparison. So, you know, as you know, in the United States, like Europe and like the UK, there are a couple of distinct parties that are in the cancer funding space. So I would say one is the National Institutes of Health in the US, which has a budget of roughly $30 billion, of which maybe $5 or $6 billion is earmarked for cancer, the NCI budget per annum. But that $6 billion has a lot of people to please. It has to pay for all the basic science laboratories, has to pay for all the translational science, and a subset of that is allocated for cooperative groups to run clinical trials in oncology. And there are several cooperative groups. They've constantly been coalescing and reforming over the years, but they have the abbreviations that you'll know very well. You know, the ECOG cooperative group, the SWOG cooperative group, things that you'll have heard of because of the long history of distinguished clinical trials. We also have a large for-profit sector, the pharmaceutical industry, that right now is running the lion's share of clinical trials. By some estimates, 80–90% of clinical trials that seek to advance cancer science is run by the pharmaceutical industry. So they really do largely set, I think, the research agenda, both in the US and globally. I think, you know, we've seen recently, the UK has done really a marvelous job of creating sort of large groups to run adaptive clinical trials like Stampede, we could probably talk about. The US, I think many of us who work here, we feel like we've lagged a little bit behind. We don't have the resources of an NHS. We don't have that single kind of infrastructure, and clinical trials as a result have faced a little bit of an uphill battle. I should say one thing about our cooperative groups. Because the budget is not as vast as one might wish, cooperative groups often have to enter into clinical trials where they get the blessing of the pharmaceutical industry. They need the industry to donate the drug, and if you need the blessing of the industry, you may need to make sacrifices in terms of trial design so that the industry is also satisfied with that trial design. And that may have led to some compromises that some of us, regret. But I think that's the rough landscape. Maybe $5 to $6 billion NIH funding, and maybe 3 or 4 times as much industry funding, which really dominates the space.
And would you like to, I'm going to guess that you'd like to see that balance redressed. Do you think there's a mechanism to do that, or do you have any optimism that imbalance could be redressed in the future?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. I guess I would say that I think the imbalance must be addressed. And I want to draw a different imbalance, not between the federal government and the industry. The imbalance between what we pay at a federal level in taxes for healthcare and what we pay for cancer research. So we spend roughly through CMS, Medicare, and Medicaid, we spend roughly $1 trillion at the federal level on healthcare. If you factored in sort of subsidies given to employer-based health insurance, that number will rise even more. So we're spending $1 trillion on healthcare, and you and I both know that there's a substantive portion of cancer care that we really don't have a firm verdict on. We don't know for sure if it makes our patients live longer or live better. That may be on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars. And if you contrast that with a research agenda that's, certainly less than $30 billion, I think you have an irrational system. In several cases, it probably would make sense to run more clinical trials because a clinical trial could potentially save the US taxpayers so much money if it were to find that the intervention didn't work, and it would save patients so much suffering. So I think the ratio between research and paying for healthcare is fundamentally skewed in the US. Now, to fix it, I think the answer is, in my lifetime, I think there will be a remedy. And I think so only because the US spends such a large amount of our GDP on healthcare. We're near 20% of GDP on healthcare. There has to be a threshold beyond which a society cannot spend that much on healthcare. Nobody can spend 50% of GDP on healthcare. There's some ridiculous amount. And the US is increasingly facing pressure to come to terms with, why is our healthcare expenditure so great? And research is a beautiful way to eliminate wasteful healthcare spending by choosing to fund what actually works and not what doesn't work.
It sounds as though your optimism comes from a place where the system is so broken,
right,
that it has to be fixed, and
yes,
and that actually money will fix it. It's actually the need for money that will bring it to fix. Because of the huge costs of drugs, what's your view on post-registration studies, marketing surveillance, making sure that we collect real-world data on patients once the drugs are out there? If we can't control what happens before registration, can we do anything more positive after that?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And maybe for the listeners, I'll give a little bit of background as to, why your question I think is so good. Listeners should know that the average cancer drug that comes to market, at least in the United States, where we don't often get the discounts that you're able to get in the UK, but that's it. You are also paying a hefty amount, but we're paying routinely $100,000 to $200,000 per year of therapy for new cancer drug. And that would be, I think, acceptable if every single drug we had was a curative drug that transformed outcomes for people with the condition. But I think, as you and I both know, Richard, that the majority of our drugs offer modest or marginal steps forward. In fact, analyses show that the average cancer drug improves survival on the order of 2 to 3 months. That's really the range of the average cancer drug. And if you couple that, with the price of something like $200,000 a year, you have a really untenable situation, a very poor value proposition. If the same drug were seeking compensation in your nice system, it would likely be rejected until the company was able to enter into a confidential discount. So in the US, however, we don't do that. We just pay for those drugs. And I think I'm forgetting a little bit where your question was going, but I guess I wanted to show that the value proposition is very, very poor for some of these cancer drugs. And your question is about real world, and I remember real world data and post market, yeah. the other thing to remember is that when the drugs are studied, they're often studied in people 10 years younger than the average cancer patient with fewer comorbidities. And if you take a 2-month survival advantage in somebody 10 years younger with no medical problems, and you start to use that drug in 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds with other medical problems, many of us legitimately wonder if that 2-month benefit is preserved or if it is eroded. And I think there's a lot of emerging literature that shows it is eroded. Those benefits get smaller as people become more frail. And I think the crying need for post-marketing surveillance, real-world data, as you allude to, is the need to ensure that what we're paying for, so much money, what's causing our patients so much toxicity, that the benefit is worth it for patients on the back end for those drugs. And I think there is a huge mandate and a need to do that. Now, you're asking a very tough question, which is who's the person who's going to crack the whip? What's the regulator going to do if they don't?
Yeah, and I, for those of us who have read your book, it's difficult to think that you have a high opinion of the FDA, and the bar is, I mean, high is not the right word.
Yeah.
So yeah, you might be optimistic about things being so broken they have to fix. It seems you're somewhat pessimistic about which authorities are going to do it.
Well, I guess I would say that's an excellent point. I mean, I guess I would say that the people who work at the FDA, I believe, are for the overwhelming majority, their heart is in the right place. They're smart people, and they're doing the best they can. And what my book tries to highlight is that one of the common sort of objections the FDA says is that we're just doing what the law says. We're not actually making policy. We're just following the law. And my book aims to show that there is a large amount of administrative discretion that agencies like the EMA and the FDA have. And the FDA is choosing to be on the permissive side of that discretion and not on the rigorous side for, what's really best for patients. And I guess I think the real motivation is a matter of, I think, skewed incentives. In the U.S., the FDA is under tremendous pressure to approve new drugs, and individual members of the FDA who I think have a good relationship with the industry are often leave the FDA and go to work for the industry. I think there's very little professional pressure to actually raise the standards for approval, and in fact, it might be very difficult to do that within the agency. So I guess I want to say that I do fault the agency. I think that's where a lot of the problems in cancer medicine happen, but I don't want to fault the individuals. I think it's a systemic failure.
And I'm going to come on to a question that we've been asked, because I think one lever for change is our patients, the democracy of people power. And one of the questions that we've been asked already is, what role do patients have in the US system in terms of the design, development and delivery of clinical trials? The NCRI here, as we were discussing before we started, very much rely on a patient partner voice and consumer forum. I just wonder what the role of patients was in the US.
That's terrific. So I guess I would say that the answer to the question is the role of the patients in the US, I think, is still minimal, although there's increasingly calls to intensify and bring patients' voice in. Now, I guess I want to say something about the patient's voice, because I think patients obviously have the most at stake in this system, and they have the most important voice in the system. And I guess what I'm very interested in is, how do we hear from a diverse group of patients? I think it's easy to think that the advocacy groups that participate in some of these meetings speak on behalf of the broadest group of patients, but I think we shouldn't forget that folks who are motivated and have the resources to participate in advocacy groups, that might be just a portion of what patients' views are and what patients actually care about. And I guess I have proposed some things in the US that would be what I think would go a long way, which is for conditions like colorectal cancer, breast cancer. Have we ever seen a survey, a broad population level survey of what actual patients want? Not just patients who participate in advocacy groups or those at quaternary or tertiary referral centers, but people who are living in South Dakota, in Montana, people who come to my clinic in the VA who don't really want to fill out a form. What do these patients want? And I think we really do need a broader sort of expansion of the tent to bring in more patients. And having brought the patients in, I think it's important to hear their input, but I think we also have sort of a role to educate patients. I'm often find that it's important to understand. If I wanted to know, is progression-free survival important to you? I have to teach you what progression-free survival means, what it really means. And And it's something that I think even oncology fellows don't always know. As as somebody who teaches oncology fellows, I feel they don't always know. And so I think that there's a huge value that we in the oncology practice community, that we have to teach patients some of the basics and then elicit their values and preferences. But it's a two-way dialogue, and I think, Richard, it is the most important dialogue that we're going to be doing in the next 20 years. But I think it's more than just getting input. It's also a back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded always of that quote, not what's the matter with you, but what matters to you. And
right.
Your points about progression-free survival, well taken. Leslie Fallowfield here in the UK, who I know is watching just now because she's asked you a question, which I'm going to put to you in a minute, has done a lot of work showing that patients simply do not understand what progression-free survival actually means. Another question about the way you're set up in the US, the question that's come in: what incentives can we put in place for the industry, pharma, because then we shouldn't be casting them as pantomime villains in all this, but how can we incentivize them to work more openly with cooperative groups? Is there a better way for us to work in partnership?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to be very clear that I think the people who work in pharma are excellent and incredibly bright and often motivated in the right direction. And I always say that when I give lectures, some of the best lectures I give are to the industry. They ask the best questions, I think, because they're really honed in on things. And I guess, I like to tell an analogy that many years ago, I was reading about a woman who was attacked by a tiger at a zoo. And I thought to myself, oh boy, that is an awful tiger. What is going on? The tiger has attacked this woman in the zoo. And then I read in the news article that the woman had stepped over all the fencing and protection to take a selfie with the tiger, and that was when she was mauled. And I guess I say my blame for the tiger goes down, and my blame for the woman goes up a little bit. And similarly, the industry is a tiger. They are a powerful force and can be harnessed for good. And it's up to society to give them the right incentives. And so I think what we face is a failure of incentives. And I guess, to be honest with you, the incentives, unfortunately, your country alone cannot fix the incentive problem. Because if you look at global cancer R&D spending, maybe it's on the order of roughly $150 billion per annum. And if you really parse that out, maybe $100 billion is in the United States alone. And so if the United States is such a huge portion of the revenue, the industry is naturally going to be incentivized by the needs and desires of the United States. And the United States desires are perverse. Our FDA is always lowering the bar. You can get a drug approved with an uncontrolled study of 40 people. If you can shrink tumors in 1 in 5 people, shrink it 30% or more. Even if the drug has severe toxicity and severe AEs. Once the drug comes to the market, you can charge any price you want, and Medicare, the US payer, is mandated by law to pay for the drug. And so when you allow the industry a low regulatory hurdle for approval and a high profit margin, you're going to incentivize marginal Me Too duplicative drugs. And in fact, some might wonder, what happens if you remove the hurdle at all? That's actually something the industry, it would really rock incentives and probably lower prices, because you need some hurdle to prevent very small biotechnology firms from just launching competitive compounds. So having some arbitrary hurdle, a response rate of, as we saw with nivolumab in small cell lung cancer, a response rate of 12% gets you approved. So that's a small hurdle to clear, but that hurdle is enough to keep out a huge juggernaut of competitors, and it keeps prices high and gives that FDA seal of approval. So I think that the industry is not to be faulted. The industry is a smart player in the system. They are following the incentives, and the incentives, however, have been created through political processes that are fundamentally broken and I think fueled by short-term profit and incentives like that. And so that's the problem here.
Okay, thank you. You talked about response rates. One of the flip side of clinical trials is the toxicity.
Yeah.
And a question we've been asked here is, why do so many cancer trial patients show 15 to 20% toxicity, conclude that treatment is well tolerated, especially when patients are rarely, if asked, whether they tolerate the toxicity well? What's your thinking about how we should be reporting toxicity? I mean, take the point of Q21, 3-weekly dosing versus daily dosing, common toxicity criteria dosing. How are we better representing some of the miseries we're asking our patients to live through?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I guess I would say that, every time I go to a cancer lecture and somebody says it's well tolerated, I cringe, because I think, it's easy for the investigator to think it's well tolerated, but you're not living with the pill, you're not living with the medicine, and you're not living with the person who has that condition. And I think so often you see the real side of cancer medicine when you spend a weekend with somebody who's suffering from cancer. You have to take care of them, and you're the caretaker. I guess I would say, I think I don't have a terrific answer. I mean, I think some of the things that step forward are patient-reported outcomes. Give patients apps to track their symptoms. Give them diaries. Give them logs. I've also suggested that in pivotal randomized controlled trials, we let patients take video diaries, and they can talk in front of a camera like you and I are talking right now about how they really feel. And those videos can go in a vault. They can be kept private. And then when the drug comes for regulatory approval, regulators can listen to some videos at random. What is it like to be taking this medicine? When you go to these drug meetings and the regulators are deciding whether or not to approve the drug, there are always a few patients who will come and testify. But those are patients who are the ones doing well. They've survived. They don't have severe toxicity. They can make it to the meeting. If you allowed videos to be played, you can hear from the patients who unfortunately don't do well. They might not have made it to the meeting. And you can really get a sense of what we get a sense of in the doctor's office, which is a medicine that is billed to us as so marvelous. And our patients come back 2 weeks later and they throw the pills at me and say, "Get out of here, doc. This is awful." That's the truth about tolerability. And I think so, and we could talk about health-related quality of life and those kinds of things, but as we know, some of those questionnaires can be gamed. If you have a drug that has a 6-week, you take it for 4 weeks on, 2 weeks off. If you do the questionnaire after 4 weeks or after 6 weeks, you'll get remarkably different results if there's a 2-week washout period. And so I think sometimes you really have to listen to somebody. And I hate to say it, but as a doctor, the closest I get to really knowing how tolerable medicines are is to sit in the exam room and listen to someone talk about it for 15, 20 minutes. And I wonder if you feel the same.
Yeah, I don't think there's an oncologist in the world who's prescribed what was described as a tolerable medication and then seen that patient come back to clinic and wondered what on earth they meant by tolerable. We've all seen patients who've not met the profile, or the paper profile is not what we've seen in the clinic. You mentioned a little bit about access and how we reach different groups, apps, and there's a question here which difficult to ignore in the current times with everything that's happening on the streets in the US and the UK. How easy is it in the USA to secure clinical trial participation by members of the Black and minority ethnic communities, especially those with limited finances or access to healthcare insurance? Are they a group that have less well represented in clinical trial work in the US?
The answer to that is unfortunately yes. I think the answer is unfortunately a resounding yes. By folks who are marginalized for being a racial minority, an ethnic minority, for even minorities in terms of sexual preferences, gender identity, folks who are minorities in terms of income or on the lower end of the income distribution. These are all folks that don't have access to clinical trials the same way as affluent majority folks do. And I think that is a deep problem in two ways. One, to the individual people who may want a clinical trial if that's the right choice for them. It's problematic for those people. It's problematic for all of us, because if we do clinical trials in sort of very narrow slices of the population, we don't really know how well the drugs work in broader everyday Americans, people who look like all of us. We don't really know that. And so it hurts both ends. Similarly, the age of patients, younger people, of course, overrepresented in clinical trials, people with comorbidities. Even studies show if the comorbidity has nothing to do with the mechanism of the drug or the side effects of the drug, there's still often these arcane prohibitions on who can go in clinical trials. People who need clinical trials the most, sometimes people with brain metastases, aren't allowed to go on clinical trials. They're the ones who need it. They have obviously the worst cancer. These are all things that I think are frustrations in the system. In terms of how you address them, I think some of them can be addressed at the level of the FDA. I keep coming back to that, but it's really one of the major downward forces. We have proposed a sort of a novel idea, which is that we have an accelerated approval pathway that we typically grant drugs provisionary approval if they improve a surrogate endpoint like response rate, and later when they improve survival, give them the full approval. we can modify that and say, if you do a clinical trial in a population of affluent urban dwellers, maybe you'll get an accelerated approval contingent on you showing the drug works the same in everyday people from all communities of all different racial ethnic groups. So we can use the same sort of carrots and sticks, I think, to help this problem. But it's a great question, and it's something that we still struggle with in 2020.
Yeah, and I think your idea of a kind of what you might call an expanded access plus, with expanded access with data as a prerequisite of getting expanded access would be one way to solve it. Also talking about contemporary times, I just wanted to think about COVID a little. You know, for most of us during COVID, we thought we might catch up with stuff, and I thought I might catch up with your output, but you're doubling time over COVID. You've thought a lot about what COVID is telling us. I have a two-part question, if I can. First of all, the research that's going on during COVID, what does that tell us about what's good or bad about the way to do research? And my second question is, what do you think the cancer research landscape will look like post-COVID? Certainly in the UK, because we rely a lot on charitable funding, and we're expecting the economy to tank a little, we can't expect the sort of sums that we previously had. And I just wonder what your thoughts were on those two issues.
No, those are terrific questions. I guess I would think that COVID has, I think, allowed a lot of people to see things that we insiders have seen for years, because it makes the landscape move faster. So, you know, by that I mean in COVID, I guess I would say many people have said that there are a lot of things about COVID research that are different. We've had major retractions. Surgisphere was retracted from the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. A paper that said whether or not masks prevented viruses from going through was retracted in the Annals because they were incorrect about what the test could actually measure, the number of particles the test could actually measure. So the test was fundamentally flawed. So we've had some really sort of major journals drop the ball, and we've had preprints that have been led to small scandals. We've had modelers who have been pilloried for both models and for extracurricular activities. We've seen so much drama around COVID research, and people ask me, is this unusual? Is this just COVID bringing out the worst in scientists? And I also want to talk a little bit about all the good things we've seen too, but we've seen a lot of things. And I want to say that for me, the jury is still out. I think the one possibility is COVID has just compressed 20 years of a clinical medicine into 6 months. You know, we've moved so quickly through it. We've turned so many people into COVID researchers that perhaps we've just seen a compression of what normally happens. I think some of the things that are being highlighted are, in the United States, we have 2 million people who have this condition, and we've randomized maybe 2% or 1% of those patients. That's a failure, I think. In the midst of a pandemic, we are giving patients daily tocilizumab, dexamethasone, we're giving them zinc, hydroxychloroquine, we're giving them Tamiflu, we're giving them ceftriaxone, and we're not learning if any of these medicines help and to what degree. In the UK, you've done, I think, a very laudable job with the recovery trial, which has now given us useful information that dexamethasone is actionable, that it will help improve outcomes. And unlike the US remdesivir trial, this is something that will have global implications because of the price of the medicine. The French, although they had some challenges with some prominent spokespeople for hydroxychloroquine, they're running the discovery trial, which is a useful trial. WHO is running Solidarity. I guess what we're learning is that when you have a crisis, you need a strong infrastructure, and it has to be government funded. There's no one who's going to do the work of the people. And that infrastructure has to be able to run randomized control trials to sort the wheat from the chaff. And you, thankfully in the UK, you're ahead of where we are in the US. And I think I view COVID as an opportunity to show US policymakers, politicians, who may not be motivated by many things, but one thing they are motivated by is a sense of pride in this nation's, I think, scientific history, to realize that we are very much falling behind, and we're not keeping up with leading nations like the UK and like France in terms of running the really important clinical trials in a pandemic. And what I hope the take-home lesson from COVID is, going forward, is whether you have a cancer that you've had for thousands of years, or you have a novel viral pandemic you've had for 6 months, Having a robust clinical trials infrastructure benefits everybody because we can answer questions about what works and what doesn't work in a timely fashion. But I do think that this is a question that, this is something that we have to persuade politicians about, and that's always not an easy task.
The recovery trial is a good example of how collaboration answers questions. And I guess if you don't have the infrastructure, it's a good reason to start creating one,
right? Because
we have big questions in cancer that we could answer more quickly with that level of collaboration. You mentioned hydroxychloroquine, and there was a question that came in along the way with. I think that the questioner may have had hydroxychloroquine and its political cachet in mind when they answered it. How much do you think fake news affects scientists and policy at the moment? And I guess there's the corollary to that is what's our job as researchers and scientists to keep fake news out of our business?
Oh boy, that is that's such a marvelous question, and I think it's a challenging one for me. I guess I would say is, and recently on my podcast, I interviewed a philosopher who's an expert on misinformation and disinformation, which are things that plague the West these days. And what this philosopher talked about is that it is easy to think of archetypes, clear examples where that's fake news, that's misinformation, that's disinformation. What this philosopher also talked about is how it's very difficult to come up with a definition that encapsulates what's fake from what's real and from what's people really believe, but is based on preliminary, partial, incomplete, inconclusive data. That on this margin, it's a feather edge. It's very, very difficult. So I tend to believe that. I think it's really fuzzy. There are lots of things we do in oncology based on uncontrolled studies of 20 or 40 people. If you did a randomized trial later, that might be proven to be false. Would that make that fake news? I think not necessarily. It's not necessarily meant to be malicious. On the other hand, zinc, hydroxychloroquine, all these kind of red herrings that we heard. So what do I think we could do about it? I think we have to be very careful. When it comes to things that we can correct misinformation about or sort of ideas, we can correct it. I also think we have to be careful of making an opposite error, which is there are some fringe views that are so foolish and misguided. The more we talk about them, the more we give them oxygen and let the people who believe in those fringe views, let those views have false legitimacy and thrive. And I think one of the mistakes I struggle with on social media is I see a lot of really noted doctors going after really fringe views. And I fear that they're just pouring gasoline on a fire, if that makes sense. They're drawing attention to a view that was going to be forgotten and no one was going to care about it at all. And so I think all of us who care about, science and about truth and realize that truth is not something, it's never a state you're in, it's always a process you're going through. We should do our best to steer people towards what's true and to correct ideas that are wrong within a reasonable sense of what you can be wrong about, and not to go after, the extreme fringe. And I think we should ignore them. There's always been people who hold, absolutely crazy views in every moment in history, but they didn't always have the internet and you wouldn't always hear about them and they wouldn't always get together. So this is something new. And I think maybe it's up to us to resist the temptation to point out all the things wrong about it and maybe focus on what we're building over here, which is, hydroxychloroquine. It did have some data. It was reasonable to test, and now it's been tested a couple of times and it doesn't work. So we're done with that, So I think we have to kind of stay over on this side of things. I don't know, but I don't have the right answers, and that's why I talked to a philosopher of science for a long time, and she made me more confused, but in a smarter way, I think.
I like the idea that, if you're 3 standard deviations, the problem with there's these people who are 3 standard deviations away from the mean with an opinion, but they now have a megaphone. But maybe we should just
that's well put. Yeah.
How do we? Back to the second part of my question. What do you, with your crystal ball, how do you think the cancer research landscape might look next year, the next 5 years, as we come out of COVID? Let's assume there's going to be some degree of global recession, charitable funding is down, etc. What do you predict might happen to the cancer research landscape?
Well, that is a great question, and I guess I would say, maybe the only way to think about the question is to think about it very, very broadly. Every night before I go to bed, I read books about global history between 1919 and 1939. And those are not great years to read about global history. Those are tumultuous years. But I think we would be wrong to think that there are not some parallels to today. Worsening income inequality. I think people whose wages have stagnated, strong nationalist sentiments rising around the world, people who are rightly frustrated but maybe seeking the wrong answers in the wrong political figures. And we have a political figure in the U.S. who says that our upcoming election this year is literally for the soul of this nation. And I guess I want to say that cancer research agenda has to be thought of in this context of we are facing unprecedented choices, I think, globally. Which direction will we go? We could so easily be torn in an anti-science direction, in a moment. I think not to be alarmist, but I think we have to have a reasonable, we have to fight for, I think, what we care about, which is science. So I'm hoping that the next 5 to 10 years, society will make the choices, I think, that support science, that support research. I think we can't take that for granted, and we have to work on that. And having made those choices, to pursue, I think, policies that embrace rather than reject scientific thinking. And what do I mean by that? I think we saw with COVID that there were a number of nations who were, perhaps even our own, didn't accept the problem, didn't listen to pandemic scientists, have defunded public health and pandemic response. That was the US. Prior to COVID, we had defunded something. We had shelved coronavirus vaccine programs a decade ago because we thought that's not a good use of money. Who wants to spend $50 million on a coronavirus vaccine? And then now we've lost trillions of dollars because okay. So what I want to say is that investing in science is about, it's not just because it's going to give you something tomorrow. It's because it's the only path forward for knowledge, and you never know when you're going to need it. And when you don't want to look back and think, for $50 billion, if we had a vaccine with at least some partial immunity to COVID, we would be, can you imagine how many trillions of dollars would be saved globally? It would be a massive difference. And similarly, cancer research funding, science funding, these have to be priorities in any nation that seeks to be strong on the order of decades. And so I hope that in the next 5 to 10 years, we make good choices and we invest in science in an unprecedented way. And so I think COVID might be an opportunity, as you point out, our budgets are going to be hurting, our philanthropy is going to decline in the short term, but maybe this is a time to say we need governments to really invest in this, that this is a way to sort out important clinical questions. Anyway, those are just some scattered thoughts.
Well, I was just thinking as you said that maybe you should run for office, and that would give us the rest of us some time to catch up on your output, I guess.
That's a tough gig.
Perhaps predictably, there's been quite a lot of questions about this relationship, that this tango we're in with pharma, and you've talked about this already about the tiger. Rather than stick, you talked about a carrot and stick. There's a question here about the carrot. What can we do to better drive, to incentivize, is the word used, pharma, to better design drug trials, and including that post-marketing piece? How can we be good partners, good advisories, good counsel to pharma? And what should we be telling them, and how should we be working with them to design better trials?
Okay, well, I think that's the greatest question, and I guess I would say, what goes into a great clinical trial? Well, one, you first test drugs in people who need them the most. 2, you measure what matters and not what's merely measurable. That's important. 3, you test drugs against the best things we can do currently. And 4, you use crossover appropriately. So what do I mean by all this? I think if you want to incentivize the industry to do the right thing, we need to do clinical trials initially in advanced disease states. So 3rd line, 2nd line, advanced line cancer. That has a few benefits. 1, those are patients with the greatest unmet medical need. They often have the fewest alternative choices and the least randomized data to guide their care. And the next thing is, unfortunately, they're at high risk of death, so the event rate will be high, and so you'll answer questions in a very timely fashion. The next thing is, the endpoints that we measure have to be endpoints that matter. We have to measure survival and quality of life. Quality of life can't be an afterthought. It can't be something you sometimes measure. It has to be something you always measure. We want cancer drugs that improve survival and quality of life, or one or the other. And different people might be willing to accept different combinations. But I'll be honest with you, when you look at cancer drugs, they tend to improve both or neither. There are very few that improve one and not the other. That is just a sort of an observation that people don't talk a lot about. I think the control arm of cancer clinical trials You can't test ibrutinib against chlorambucil. You can't test nivolumab against dacarbazine. You can't use a control arm that no one is really using in developed nations. And you can't run global clinical trials if the only goal of the global trial is to go to a nation to take advantage of a very poor standard of care because the drugs are so unaffordable. I think that's exploitative, as I describe in the book. And then crossover, which is an issue that will take me like 30 minutes to explain, that's something that matters. So, I mean, it doesn't take much to incentivize the industry to do the right thing. You just say, you know, I want you to do trials in broadly representative people, measure things we care about, and I think the rest will follow. The industry will realize they should go after latter line settings, and they realize they have to go against the best available care. So, I mean, I think that there are just a few regulatory things, and that's why I think in chapter 14 of my book, I really try to make the case that with current legislative rules, we can do a lot.
Agreed. And I think you lay it out very well in the book. I think the sections on crossover is a lesson that all oncologists need to learn, and you lay it out exceptionally well. Another question here, that's something you've talked about a lot, and I think I might ask for your shorter answer on this. Does the FDA ever go on to look at overall survival after it approved drugs based on PFS and small response rates? I know you could talk for hours about this.
I guess I'd say the answer to that question, the shortest answer is that roughly 1 out of every 6 drugs that's improved based on those surrogate endpoints is later shown to improve overall survival. And 5 out of 6, it's not, or we never know. And so to me, it doesn't have to be 100%, but it shouldn't be 16%. There's got to be maybe 90%. I'd be happy with 95%. We got to improve that a lot.
And I think that links to another question that's coming. Do you think all trial data should be published, including negative results? I'm going to second guess that you say yes to that. But
yeah,
so the next part of the question is, how can we ensure that that's done? How do we make sure that our house is in good order, that we publish all our results?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess I would say that one would be, one of the things people say is that, well, it's very difficult for a journal to accept these articles. So I say, we don't need to bother with journals. We can make something like clinicaltrials.gov. You can put all your data on a sort of central repository, make it easy for you, take away the excuses. And the next thing is penalties. The US has the power to fine companies for not reporting those trial data, and the other problem is academic researchers who don't report that data. They can be fined and receive penalties from the NIH. And I think you have to impose the penalties. We have a reluctance to impose penalties on our colleagues who we really like and who we think are doing a good job, but you impose a couple penalties and everyone will fall in line. And unfortunately, that's the nature of any system, is that sometimes you have to enforce the laws to get people to comply.
Yeah, we talked about carrots, but you need a stick sometimes too, don't you? Yeah. Another popular question that people have asked, you mentioned apps about health-related quality of life, PROMs, and I think we're both on the same page about that. This questioner thinks that, and several people support the view that the research community seems reluctant to go down that road. Do you think that's true? And if you think it's true, why do you think that is? Why are people unwilling to use apps to collect real-time PROMs and health-related quality of life?
I guess I would say that, I think there's more enthusiasm than that question may admit to. But I guess I would say that, maybe they're hitting something on the head, which is that maybe to some degree, I think academics are a little bit of technophobes, that we're a little reluctant to use technology. After all, look at how much difficulties I had just logging onto this. It's been, people don't know, but we had to do this like 4 times before I could figure it out.
Yeah, I thought it'd been quicker for us to fly to Belfast, wouldn't it?
that's what you told me. I was tempted to do it. I think, but maybe to some degree that's a little bit of a joke, but there's some truth to that. There are a lot of trialists who have become very comfortable, I joke that there was once a very famous trialist I knew who had to get one of the junior people to do his email for me. The junior person had to sit in the chair and he would dictate the email because he wasn't very good at figuring out where the email came from. But I think there is something to be said for doctors and trialists having some natural reluctance to embrace technology. But thankfully, there's so much, I think, money and interest in this space that this is something that's coming. I'm not too worried about this. I think we will have apps that do this. Whether or not the industry wants us to capture quality of life in every trial, that's a bigger question.
We're going to have to wrap up fairly soon, but I want to give an opportunity, as you say on your podcast often, on a positive note. There's a question here. What can the UK learn from the US on how to conduct cancer trials? What's the best part of the US trial system and landscape? What should we be looking at in the UK? What should we be looking at in the US system and saying we should be doing more of that?
I mean, that's a great question. What can you learn from us? I guess I would say that, if you really wanted to sit back and think about cancer medicine from 1920 to 2020, the last 100 years of cancer medicine, I think the U.S. has had a great contribution, which is that we were the most optimistic. In the 1920s and 1930s, there were a lot of doctors globally who felt like cancer was something that we could do nothing about. And the thing the US brought, maybe more than any other nation, was a lot of doctors who were willing to say that that's probably not right. Well, maybe we can try even things that were thought to be very draconian in the effort that we could improve outcomes. When you read history books about, what the sort of uphill climb folks like DeVita had to go through and Farber, there's some courage to that for somebody to come along and say that just because this is the way cancer is doesn't mean this is the way it has to be. I think right now, the best thing the U.S. has going for it is, we have people who do basic science who are really innovative, who are thinking. I mean, this is not to say that it's not true globally. You also have it. It's true in all nations. But we do have people doing really good basic science, trying to move to explore pathways and targets that have never been explored. I think that's probably the best of what we do, is that we are people who are not satisfied with cancer outcomes, and we're trying to do better. I think my whole book is about how it's not the intention that's wrong, it's that our policies could be a whole lot better. But I think our heart is in the right place in the US.
And I agree. And I'm going to finish with the most popular question on the whole poll, which I have some sympathy with. It's from Professor Dame Leslie Fallowfield, and she says, Vinay, you're so prolific. What's the secret? When, if ever, do you sleep?
Oh boy. Well, I guess I'd say that's very kind of her. I guess I would say that, the truth is that I sleep 8 hours a day minimum, because I do enjoy a good night's rest. Otherwise, I can't function well. And I paid my price in medical training. But I guess I would say that, if it appears that I'm very productive, it's an illusion created by the people I work with. So, every single publication that I'm on, at least these days, the first author is somebody who's a resident, a student, or a fellow, almost invariably, or junior faculty to me. And since I'm only 5 years out, it's not too many people. What I mean by that is that I work with good people. They do all the hard work, and I'm just providing them a little bit of guidance around the edges to kind of shape the way they're going, but I'm not really doing a lot there. And I think that that probably explains sort of the research side of things. And then in terms of doing a podcast, I'm blessed to have a great producer who does the hard work of editing and turning the nonsense I say into a passable podcast. And in terms of writing a book, unfortunately, that was done like 100% on airplanes, mostly going to and from Europe to talk to great folks like yourself. So, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. But, recently in my last podcast, I don't know if you listened, but we did a little thing about how to write. And I think, if I don't know if there are folks out there who do a lot of bicycling, but I was always interested in bicycling, and then I talked to people who do 100-mile bike rides, and for years that to me was very daunting. And then something happened once in my life, and then I had to do a lot of 100-mile bike rides in a row, and I realized that a lot of it is a psychological barrier. That you're just not psychologically ready to do 100 miles, and then you do it, and then it's actually not as bad as you thought. Similarly, writing, I think the biggest thing we do when we write is that we second guess ourselves. We think we could be doing a better job. And I encourage people to just write your first drafts and just write it and be happy with what it is, and then just let it sit for a while before you look at it again and then edit it later. It's sometimes the hardest is to go from blank paper to have something down. Sometimes the easiest is just to write it and not to be self-conscious.
Well, that's great advice. Thank you. And predictably, there were many questions that we didn't get time to answer. That you were always going to attract a lot of interest. I know from reading those questions that people can find a lot of the answers by reading your book or heading to your podcast. And maybe we should be speaking to the training program directors to put it on the syllabus for all our oncologists here. Vinay, I just want to thank you very much for giving us your time. I know it was a bit technically difficult, and we were looking forward to hosting you in Belfast. Maybe I do hope we can host you in person at NCRI in the future. And from everyone at the NCRI, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, and I would love for that to happen, Richard. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.